Recently, the Armstrong Institute and others have made claims that Senenmut, who lived during the time of Queen Hatshepsut, was the biblical Moses. And this has created quite a stir among advocates of the early Exodus date. But is Senenmut really the biblical Moses? Find out on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Today we are going to explore the recent claim by Christopher Eames, a writer for the Armstrong Institute, that Senenmut was the biblical Moses. Now, to do this examination, we're going to have to break down how Eames arrived at the claim that Senenmut was the biblical Moses. Now, Senenmut was a very powerful courtier and an extremely accomplished administrator that lived during the time of Queen Hatshepsut. Now, Eames begins with the idea of the early Exodus date, and he starts with the notion that 1 Kings 6:1 established that 480 years elapsed between the Exodus and the building of Solomon's temple, which began in circa 967 BC. And you take 967 and you add to 480 years, and this leads you to the early Exodus date of 1446 BC. Eames then uses the personality types for the kings of Egypt and the, quote, standard high chronology to arrive at Amenhotep II as the pharaoh of the Exodus. Eames also states that Kamosa was the pharaoh that knew not Joseph, which is remarkable since Kamosa was killed in battle long before being able to drive out the Hyksos from Egypt. But in doing so, he arrives at the conclusion that Hatshepsut was the Pharaoh's daughter that adopted Moses. So, where does Eames get his information from? His sources are Douglas Petrovich, an investigative journalist, Scott Allen Roberts, and Antonio Crasto. And you can find this all in Christopher Eames' article, Is This Moses, from Let the Stone Speak, March-April 2024, page 24. Now, for those of you who've been subscribers of the channel for any length of time, you will recognize the name Douglas Petrovich as the source of all manner of incompetence. But Crasto is a new name. Who exactly is Antonio Crasto? He is a professor at the University of Naples Federico II in the Department of Agriculture. His specialization is the biology of Nile tilapia. Yes, he's a fish biologist. Okay. All right. Anyway, Petrovich places Hatshepsut at about 12 years old at the time of Moses' adoption, and he believes that Hatshepsut is the daughter of the pharaoh who adopted Moses, although he has not stated that he believes Senenmut was Moses. Similarly, Crasto holds that Hatshepsut was 15 at the time of Moses' adoption, and Christopher Eames, supported by Crasto, claims that Senenmut is to be identified as the biblical Moses. And both Petrovich and Crasto assert that Senenmut was a commoner and a foreigner. So, the story they weave is that Senenmut was a commoner and a foreigner whose parents took on Egyptian names, and Senenmut was then adopted by Queen Hatshepsut. After that, Senenmut joins the military, campaigned in the land of Kush, and once Hatshepsut became queen, only then did Senenmut become, quote, the most influential courtier, end quote. Senenmut's tomb, Theban tomb 353, was unfinished and abandoned. Similarly, his sarcophagus was also left unfinished in Theban tomb 71. This shows, according to Eames, that Senenmut suspiciously disappeared from the Egyptian record, quote, without a trace, end quote. The article then states that the last dated reference to Senenmut was around year 18 to 19 of Hatshepsut. Eames states that the co-regency of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III began in 1504, and according to the standard high chronology, would put year 18 to 19 at 1486 BC, exactly 40 years before the early Exodus date, page 28 of his article. Eames ends the article with an open question. Could another such individual with that administration have been the biblical Moses? End quote. Now, Eames makes this conclusion a rhetorical question to preemptively defray criticism that he is concluding that Senenmut was Moses. This gives him plausible deniability if he was in fact wrong. But make no mistake about it, he's really saying that Senenmut was Moses. Okay? Okay, so, was Senenmut really Moses? Let's examine the argument, and let's see if it holds water. Okay, so my first concern with Eames' theory is his method. Historians would call this a plausibility argument based upon cosmetic similarities. The problem with using cosmetic similarities is that there is often not a necessary connection between historical figures and their parallels. While it is appropriate to make comparisons where parallels exist, it is important not to read too much into those comparisons. Otherwise, one can overread what the evidence suggests, and that's when parallelomania results. In cases like what Eames is making, he would need what is called a smoking gun to draw the conclusions that he does. A smoking gun is a piece of evidence that shows that a parallel is more than just a parallel, but that the evidence suggests instead the two identities being one and the same person is more likely than not. Eames has not provided that sort of evidence here. My second concern is his use of the standard high chronology. There are a number of problems here. Eames places the Exodus at 1446 BC, but claims that Amenhotep II was the pharaoh of the Exodus. The problem is that the standard high chronology puts the reign of Amenhotep II at circa 1439 to 1413 BC, 7 years after the early date of the Exodus, and places the accession of Thutmose III to 1493. Eames is trying to have his cake and eat it too. He needs 1446 BC and Amenhotep II to correlate, and Thutmose III's accession to be in 1504 BC. Eames is not consistent with his use of the standard high chronology, and his math simply doesn't work. That said, almost the entirety of modern chronologists has rejected the high chronology. The reason is that the synchronisms from the Amarna letters have literally destroyed the high chronology, while early Exodus diehards have desperately clung to the Sothic cycle evidence to prop up the high chronology. It's really a lost cause. This is especially true given that not even the high chronology supports their position. They only cling to it because it is less detrimental to their position, and they believe that they can push the dates towards what they believe. However, as we have shown, they have to change the high chronology not just by a year or two, but by several years. My third concern is that Eames does not recognize the idiomatic use of 40 in the text, and he is therefore doing poor exegesis as he is formulating his interpretation. My fourth concern is Eames' quote, disappear without a trace, end quote, argument. In practical terms, all this means is that we have no further mention of Senenmut. But Eames reads into that to suggest that Senenmut must have fled Egypt at that time. But there is no evidence to suggest that this is what happened. It is an absence of evidence argument. And there are several things that might have happened that could explain this end to Senenmut in the historical record. Some examples are the records were destroyed, he fell into a river, got eaten by a crocodile, and his body was never recovered, or his tomb wasn't in a complete enough state and he was buried elsewhere. We just don't know because we lack evidence to what happened ultimately to Senenmut, because very few of Senenmut's monuments are dated. My fifth concern is the identification of Hatshepsut as, quote, the daughter of Pharaoh, end quote, who adopted Moses. Generally, there are two classes of women in Egypt that were not permitted to adopt children: slaves and the daughters of kings or future kings. On the one hand, Hatshepsut was the daughter of Thutmose I, which would have made her ineligible to adopt a child. On the other hand, Hatshepsut died at age 50, according to the examination of her mummy, and she reigned as king for 21 years. This means she would have had to have been born in 1533 BC, according to their non-standard high chronology. They also maintain that Moses was born in 1526. This means that Hatshepsut would have been 7 years old when she adopted Moses. Bad math. My sixth concern rests with the details that surround the biography of Senenmut himself. When we do comparative biographies, details matter. Senenmut was a commoner, but there is nothing to indicate that he was a foreigner, despite the uncited statement in Petrovich's book. We know that Senenmut's parents were named Ramosa and Hatnofer, and they were literate commoners from the town of Hermonthis. Hermonthis was an important Middle Kingdom city just south of Luxor. Their joint tomb, which was built by Senenmut, was discovered and excavated. Ramosa's occupation is unknown. He could have been anything from a farmer to a small landowner. Ramosa died when he was between 50 to 60 years old, based upon the dental evidence. Hatnofer's mother was named Sit Jehuti, daughter of Thoth, and she is mentioned in Hatnofer's funerary papyrus that was included inside of Hatnofer's mummy wrappings. In contrast, Moses' parents were named Amram and Jochebed, Amram's father's sister, and they lived in Goshen, near Avaris, capital of the Hyksos. If you take a wooden literal reading of Exodus 6:20, Amram died at age 137, not age 50 to 60. So ultimately, they're going to have to pick and choose which numbers they decide to read literally. Similarly, Senenmut had 3 brothers, Amenemhat, Menhotep, and Pa'iri, and 2 sisters, Ahotep and Nofret Hor. On the other hand, Moses had 1 brother, Aaron, and 1 sister, Miriam. Now, while Eames has tried to explain away that Amram is a Hebrew name by claiming that Moses' father took on the Egyptian name Ramosa, Miriam is an Egyptian name, and yet that name does not appear among the list of Senenmut's sisters. We also know that Senenmut began to construct 2 tombs for himself, Theban Tomb 353 and Theban Tomb 71, seemingly at the same time. Now, we should note that this was not a rare phenomenon for high officials during Dynasty 18. Dorman, page 126 to 127. Senenmut was one of the most decorated administrators of the 18th dynasty, having dozens of titles to his name. Yet one title he never claims is son of the daughter of the king, or any title even remotely similar to that. We also know that Senenmut served in the military under other kings, and probably received his first administrative appointments under Thutmose I or Thutmose II. Furthermore, there is some evidence that Senenmut might have lived into the last decades of Thutmose III. One of his undated monuments mentions the Serat, which was what the sanctuary of Amun at Deir el-Bahri was called after it had been renamed by Thutmose III following Hatshepsut's death. The earliest attested date for the Serat naming is in the 43rd year of Thutmose III. So that when we look at his monuments and his tomb, all we can really say is that Senenmut's tomb was not used, and he may have died in such a way that, quote, precluded the recovery and embalming of his body, end quote, Dorman, page 209. But we cannot say more than that. So in conclusion, Eames' attempt to suggest that Senenmut was the biblical Moses fails on multiple fronts. The theory succumbs to parallelomania, it follows a completely discredited and distorted high chronology, it fails to recognize idioms that are used in the biblical text, it argues from an absence of evidence when it claims Senenmut, quote, disappeared without a trace, end quote. It glosses over terrible math when it tries to claim Hatshepsut adopted Moses. And the details of Senenmut's life in no way matches those of Moses. It is a bad theory and should be rejected. Anyway, I want to thank you for watching. I hope you learned something and you enjoyed this video, and we will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.